I'm Amanda Davison, a licensed marriage and family therapist and CEO at The Family Connection, where we are committed to changing mental health. Today on TFC Talks, I have Anna Aldridge, a licensed mental health counselor who is not only phenomenal as a professional and provider, but truly embodies what it means to be resilient. And so I have invited her today to share her wisdom, her expertise, and some of her lived experiences so that we can all benefit in growing in our resiliency. So today is about having resilient roots. Make sure you follow us, you hashtag resilient roots. And we're so excited today. Thank you so much, Anna, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
It is truly such a pleasure because when I think of somebody who is like the textbook picture of resilience, I think of you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And so when I think about resilience, I looked up the definition, and this is kind of why you stick out to me so much because you bring so much wisdom and lived experience. But resilience is the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. So that's a pretty heavy definition. Like there's so much to unpack in that. Break that down for our listeners, and what does resilience mean in your words?
For me, I think resilience is living life and going through those struggles, right? But not making those struggles your life. Like continuing, it's like a bump in the road, right? You're going through life and there's these speed bumps going back and forth, but you got to keep going. You got to keep going. And you are, although you go through these things, you can still live life to the fullest and get past all those struggles.
I love that you bring that up, that we're going to go through hard things,
Yes.
right? That's just part of life. But I love that it's about that perspective that you bring, which brings so much wisdom to, it may be a part of my life, but it's not my life.
Correct. It doesn't have to be your full life. You're going to go through stuff, but you can't let the hard things make your whole life. It's just part of it, and you can get through it and keep going.
So that sounds really easy. And yet I know the task of doing that is beyond hard and takes so much both internal and external skills to kind of be able to display that resiliency. So when you think about that, tell me about like what gets you through that.
To be honest, I did do a lot of therapy myself, right? Going to therapy, learning skills on how to get through these issues. I think, also I do a lot of cognitive reframing and reminding myself, just because this is a hard thing, let's look at the positives of it. Focus on the positives. Don't focus just on the negatives.
I like that you kind of bring up, like, we're holding both the negative and the positive at the same time, right? We're not ignoring it in toxic positivity that it doesn't exist, that there
Correct.
isn't hard, but we're using skills to kind of get us through that. So you said therapy helped you. Were you just born resilient?
Absolutely not.
Did you just come from like a resilient family? Like you just had these resilient roots that just flew all the way through?
Absolutely not. I think looking at my past too, like there was a lot of generational trauma, right? And I was at the point where I do not want my kids to live like this. I don't want my kids to continue the generational trauma and going over and over through generations of just this hard stuff, right? I want them to learn coping skills so they can live life better than I was able to.
So not only was it something that you like had to live through in things that were hard and really developed just an appreciation for having a different perspective, but it's also something that you aspire to change, literally change mental health for your kids and then the people that you serve moving forward.
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't get into this field until my late 30s when I started going back to school. And here I am in my 50s, and I am doing things that I never thought I could do.
Which is exactly why you are the epitome of resiliency, because, growing up in the South Valley, it's not always easy, right?
Absolutely.
And so when you think about, generational patterns, tell me a little bit, or tell our listeners a little bit about how those generational patterns might play out for people that you work with, or how those generational patterns may have played out in your life.
For me, a lot of generational patterns that occurred was, of course, growing up in the South Valley. I grew up in a time when there was a lot of gangs. You either go this way or the other way, right? And I think another thing too is a lot of generational patterns within my family, including mental illness, alcoholism. And with me, I'm Hispanic, and it's kind of taboo not to seek therapy. We keep that within the family. And so I wanted to break those habits. I wanted to break that and let everybody know, not just my own family, but let other families know within the Hispanic community that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to seek help.
Yeah, I think when I think of generational patterns, I think of that kind of quintessential rubber band, right? That rubber band that says, this is how we've always done things, right? And so when that rubber band gets expanded and we try to do something different, right, it creates a ton of tension. And in that tension, we have choices. We have choices to go back to homeostasis, or what we've known, right? Because that's, even though it's not necessarily easy, it relieves the tension because it's familiar. Or we have to kind of hold and let that tension exist, totally fearful that the rubber band's going to snap.
Absolutely.
Right? And eventually watch the system or the patterns kind of adjust to it. And so what I'm hearing you talk about is really this pattern of maintaining the tension, wanting something different, coming from, Hispanic roots, and, just machismo, and
Absolutely.
right? Like that kind of just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like don't complain about it, right? And wanting something different for your girls. And it created a lot of tension in that.
Absolutely.
And that sounds like where the skills came in to be okay holding that tension while things kind of adjusted.
Absolutely. And I think the scary part is being different within your family, right? Going out and seeking that help. And you mentioned machismo, like, of course, the Hispanic community, that's really, normal, is where men don't seek help. And they do tend to use alcoholism as a way to cope. And I want to see those changes, not only for my girls, but for my son, right? I want him to know that it's okay to talk about being sad. It's okay to cry.
To really, again, those generational roots, right? Because letting that tension exist, even though it's different, is actually what changes mental health. But staying in that same pattern, how does staying stuck in a pattern of not talking about things, being tough, just kind of, coping through substance use, how does that impact people's mental health, physical health, relationships, and just overall well-being?
Right. Well, I think that goes back to going to those generational patterns, right? If your father's an alcoholic, the boys don't learn that it's okay to release feelings, and then they may end up going into those same patterns and not knowing how to cope. So then they use alcohol to cope, and it just keeps going and going and going. And I think that's what's a little bit scary, is because there are so many that don't want to talk about their feelings. There's so much of this machismo thinking, especially in the state of New Mexico, right? Because there are a lot of Hispanic families here. But we have to do something to change those patterns so we aren't having generation after generation going into the same mindset as our elders.
Yeah, I love that you're talking about kind of underneath that nature versus nurture, right? Some of that is nature, this is our culture. This is how we do things. We, as Hispanic culture, we tend to be very social,
very much.
There's beers and there's alcohol at all of the events, right? You have a birthday party and you have a cooler that's the beers for the adults, and you have a cooler that's the Capri Suns for the kids, right?
Absolutely.
That's just part of what it's like, and then to try to do something different can sometimes feel like you're that, quintessential black sheep that is almost rejecting your roots.
Right. And it's funny that you mentioned black sheep, because I'm actually known as the black sheep in my family, right? I mean, when I was young, I was more known as a black sheep because I wasn't the greatest kid. I wasn't the greatest teenager. But now I'm more known to be that person. As everybody knows, there's always parties at my house. We're always having gatherings at my house. But I no longer bring the alcohol. I am not going to be part of that anymore. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay if people consider me the black sheep. It's okay.
It's interesting because that perception of the tension that comes on that rubber band piece, right, is the black sheep. But really what you are is the change agent.
I think I'd rather be known as that.
And so how, as that change agent, like, how do you continue to fulfill a role that is taxing? It's not like everybody's cheering you on when you're the change agent, moving things to a different pattern. How do you deal with that? And how do you tell other people who might be feeling like they're really pushing towards change and it's causing tension? How do you encourage them, or what skills would you tell them they need to develop to break those generational patterns?
Well, for me, I think it goes back to letting people make their own choices, right? And I do teach them, like, even within my family, when they come in, they're like, oh, where's the beer? And I said, well, if you want to go get some, you're welcome to. There's a Giant right down the street, and letting them make their own choices. But I also let them know how I feel about it. And I'm okay with that, right? But it's funny that you mentioned that, because within my family, there is a lot of alcoholism, right? We do like to celebrate with alcohol. But as the years have gone by and I've changed these patterns over the last 5 years, I've noticed more and more that's kind of declining within all the men in my family, which is amazing.
Well, what do you think that is? Like, what do you know about human behavior and patterns that might give you insight into what's changing that?
Well, I think it's a social thing, right? Where everybody's like, oh, I need to be this way. I need to act a certain way in order to be around my family, right? Let's continue drinking because I don't want to be the one that's left out. But now they're starting to understand it's okay to not think like everybody else. It's okay to be your own person and not have to follow. Be the leader.
Yeah, so they're getting some lived experience, like, oh, wait, we can have fun without, like, being trashed?
Right.
Well, who saw that coming?
Exactly.
Right? Like, okay. And it also sounds like sometimes what ends up happening is there's not the negative consequences. Right? I think of weddings, right? Like, how many times at weddings, I'm just going to use New Mexico, I'm sure it happens other places, right? But there's like this plan of like, okay, what's going to happen when so-and-so gets into a fight?
Right, exactly. And you just got to kind of roll with it and be your own person and move forward.
And now, not having the alcohol, we're like, wait, we had a whole wedding and nobody got in a fight.
Exactly.
And everybody got to be their own person. And it was like, we have a really great experience without some of those negative consequences too.
Absolutely. I mean, because I did grow up like that. I grew up with my family fighting other people at weddings, graduations, me being a child watching all of this. It was pretty interesting. But I have seen changes within our family, the immaturity of that going away without the alcoholism. So
it's interesting that you say immaturity, and I definitely see that connection. And I also kind of immediately went to like polyvagal in the brain, right? And immediately went to this idea that, we're fighting because we're in a survival place. Right? We're feeling like there's a need to, like, we're not safe.
Absolutely.
And so, growing up in an environment where everybody's trying to protect safety because it feels unsafe through, fighting is kind of just that downshifting in the brain, right? And you're saying, hey guys, like, let's really look at this from a wider perspective.
Yes.
We don't have to fight for everything, and we can have safety in different ways.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that comes from, I can give you a little history with my father. Growing up, he was born here in the United States, but he had a lot of racism towards him because he only spoke Spanish when he was younger. And so he was always in that fight or flight mode, and he doesn't know how to cope, right? So he uses the alcoholism and the fighting to cope.
Which makes so much sense when you think about it from a generational place, right? Like he literally came to, a country that was not only not welcoming of him, but many, like, I don't want the opposite word of welcoming, but disrespectful of him in so many ways, right?
Absolutely.
Like very much like looked down upon, right? And so he had to fight for every little thing that he got and really created this pattern of you're not going to have if you don't fight.
Right. Absolutely.
And so it makes sense in those generational patterns. It's not like everybody sat you down with all your siblings and your aunts and your uncles or your tias and your tios, where they're like, okay, guys, now growing up in this family, what it means is you have to fight for everything.
Never even sat down as a family. Right? So it was never talked about. We don't talk about our feelings, right? We don't talk about our feelings. We just deal with them. And I think, again, that's where comes the generational patterns of going back to the fighting and the alcoholism, and then different ways of coping and not in healthy ways.
Yeah, so it's not like people are saying this is how we are. It's we as human beings like learn to watch and observe, and we pick those patterns up. And so everyone in the family kind of is like, okay, well, we need to fight for every inch that we're going to be given.
And it tends to be learned behavior, but we can change those learned behaviors. And I think that's where, why I became a therapist, is because I know that these behaviors can be, learned from childhood, but that doesn't mean you have to stay that way.
So when you think about like learning these patterns, what do you think is the first step to healing these patterns?
I think for me, it's understanding that you don't have to stay stuck. Just because you grew up in an environment that is not healthy does not mean that you have to continue your life in that unhealthy environment. Things can change.
I love that. What you're saying is the integration or the option of choice. There's something different.
Absolutely. You always have a choice. You always have a choice. It doesn't matter where you come from. There's always a choice.
One of the things I'm interested in kind of pointing out that I think sometimes we don't realize how wise we are, and I often tell you this, Anna, you just never know how wise you actually really are. Is there was this piece in there where you, without saying it, were able to identify some differences between what's healthy and what's unhealthy.
Right.
And then from there, it was a choice, right? Like, which way am I going to kind of go? How did you get that wisdom that this might not be healthy, or this is maybe a healthier
Honestly,
option?
It's that trial and error, right? Like I told you, I wasn't the greatest child. I was known as the black sheep of the family, coming in, making wrong choices. But then I got to a point where it's like, my kids are watching me. What can I do to change so they can see that I'm starting to use those healthy patterns? How can I change my own family? And so I just started making better choices.
It sounds like there was some kind of dissonance within you where you kind of tried on this mask for a while and thought that's what would feel right.
Absolutely.
But over time, it didn't seem to feel peaceful or aligned for you.
Yeah, like I said, I tried unhealthy coping skills, right? I didn't know how to cope until I did start therapy, and I started learning skills about, okay, this is how you cope in a healthy way. Because you can cope all day long, but that doesn't mean that it's in a healthy manner.
What were some of the effects, or what are some of the effects you see in your patients of unhealthy coping?
So when my patients come in and they're telling me, like, they're in this total negative mindset, and this is how I'm going to do it, and this is the way it is. And I always say, is this working for you? And usually it's not. And so we start talking about, okay, what are some healthy ways? I mean, I know you love to do this to cope, right? For example, alcoholism. I love to cope by using alcohol. If this isn't working for you, what else can you do? Let's find some other interests that you love. And then that's how we work it.
I love that. So what about it isn't working for us, right? Like,
absolutely.
Right? Like, okay, can you have 2 beers without ending up blackout drunk?
Right. Absolutely. Because that's usually what it is. It starts with 1 and it ends up 2 until they're done.
Until,
yeah.
Who am I? Like, right?
Exactly. So it's like, let's go back and let's figure this out. Because this isn't not healthy. This isn't healthy and this isn't working.
So I love that part of what you're talking about in that dysfunction is like, is this really like, it's a check-in with ourselves. Is this working for us? And some of those consequences don't have to be inevitable.
Right.
And so kind of seeing different patterns. When you think about like your life, was it easy to be that change agent, to kind of go from being, as you called it, the black sheep, right? To then going into therapy, which was totally taboo, to then trying different patterns that created tension in the system?
It was very difficult. I mean, especially for me going in to therapy in my 30s, and I had been through all of this in my life. I thought, how can I change in my 30s? I thought it's impossible. I have so many habits that I've lived with all my life. How can I change this? And it was taboo because I got made fun of for doing it within my own family. But I told myself, this isn't working for me, and I have to change something within myself. And it worked. And now I want to live my life helping others.
I love that. You went in and you said, it might be hard, but it's hard living stuck the way that I am. So I'm going to choose my hard, and I'm going to choose something different that works for me.
Yes.
Because this isn't working for me anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, when I started noticing that I wasn't being the person that I wanted to be, and especially coming into this field. How can I teach others to be the best of themselves when I wasn't even the best of myself?
What do you think, like, if you were getting really like granular and detailed on that, like what are some patterns you see where people aren't maybe the best of themselves, whether that's communication styles, parenting, coping mechanisms?
I think it goes back to even starting with parenting, right? I see some young kids and, trying to get the parents on board and having them change. And I think it takes a village, to be honest. It takes a village, even when it's adults. When they have parents who are toxic or family members that are toxic, that's when we learn boundaries. What is good for me? And I think that's where it all boils down to is it's not a selfish thing. It's more about how can I help myself be a better person, even if I have to set boundaries with people who are toxic to me and people that I love. So boundaries, that's like, I know that's a word that we live in the counseling world, but I kind of assume that that's not a world everybody else necessarily lives in. So what is a boundary and what's it meant to do? So boundaries for me, for example, I'll give you an example. Like if there's somebody toxic in my family, that doesn't mean that I don't love them. It doesn't mean I'm never going to talk to them. But the moment that person starts becoming negative and I know that it's going to affect me, I'll just shut it down and just be like, hey, is it okay if I call you tomorrow? Setting that boundary for myself when I know that it's getting too much for me. So I love that this, like for me, I think about boundaries too, in this, like what you're kind of drawing, I get very visual. It's like this fence line. Yes. Right? This is my property line and you're welcome over into my property. Like where we have some, like we can talk over the fence, we can, connect together. But at some point, if you're now trying to take over my property or it's no longer healthy, like I don't want you building a structure on my side of the property fence. Absolutely. That was perfectly said. Yes. And so you're saying, hey, look, what's happening right here isn't working on my side of the fence. And so I'm going to go back into my area and you do you. Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of times I think boundaries sometimes get this rap, and I think about Hispanic culture too, like, and all people do this, but sometimes boundaries can look like great fences of cutoff of like, and now you're dead to me. Well, especially in the Hispanic culture, right? Because we're taught that our family is the most important thing, right? Mm-hmm. As your parents get older, you're supposed to take care of them. Mm-hmm. You have to have your family's back. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much how I was raised, which I do. But on the other hand, if there is somebody toxic in my family that's causing me harm or making me not feel the way I should feel, I have to set those boundaries and making sure that it's okay, I can love you, but I'll love you from a little bit farther than you are closer, right? And letting them know that it's not okay to treat me this way.
Yeah, I love that you kind of bring that up, right? That piece of like, I get to determine the proximity or the closeness that you get to have and the influence you get to have on me.
Yes.
And really seeing, like, kind of going back to what you said before, really seeing how important the choice is and seeing that you have choices when generationally, like in some of those generational patterns, it didn't seem like choice was an option. It was just, this is how you roll.
Exactly. And that's what it is. You know, especially like I said, within my Hispanic family, it's like no matter what your family looks like, you have to have their back. But that's not necessarily true. I mean, you can have their back, but also making sure you're setting those boundaries and saying, I will help you as much as I can, but the moment you do this, then I'm going to take a step back and you have to figure that out.
I think that we grew up in very similar environments and similar patterns. And it kind of, I know for me, one of those change agents was having my children, right? What I accepted for myself was very different than what I was willing to accept or expose my kids to.
Yes.
And it became this like dissonance within me of like, wait, what's happening here? And so I think for me, kind of speaking to what you're talking about, I grew up very much like your family is everything. Like you forgive no matter what, right? 7 times 7, like 70, right? Like, and forgiveness in my family really looked like restoring the relationship.
Right.
Right? Versus necessarily being able to say, I can forgive you and I can choose not to be in relationship with you. And I don't have to be upset about it. There doesn't have to be this great wall of China like that's built in there. Like, it's just, you're not going to be part of my life now moving forward for a variety of different reasons.
Right. And I think people take forgiveness, you know, in different ways. And the way I see forgiveness is, it's not saying that you're forgiving the person and saying what they're doing is right or what they did was right. It's more of, I'm not going to allow you to have that anger hold on me because I have so much anger or pain from that. I'm not going to allow you to, have me hold on to that. We're going to let that go, but that doesn't mean I have to have a relationship with you.
I love that visual, right? Like when we're talking about fence lines, what you're saying is, and what I'm hearing you say is just this idea of forgiveness is about something that happens within ourselves.
Absolutely.
That we choose to not hold on to that pain anymore. We take the lesson from it and we let go of the rest. And we let that determine what access we give to somebody, but it doesn't necessarily mean being in relationship.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is. It's not letting them have that hold on you.
How does that tie into resiliency?
I think that goes back into that generational stuff, right? Like, even if we had all this bad stuff growing up, I have to forgive, what happened back then. I have to forgive the people in my life because they were parents themselves and they didn't know any better and they did the best they could. And I'm sure there was trauma there. They just didn't know how to cope. And so being resilient, I have to get past all of that and move forward. So
almost kind of going back to that speed bump analogy you were kind of talking about earlier, it's kind of like not choosing to like drive down the road with 3 wheels, staying stuck on this speed bump,
just got to get over it and then keep going. And there'll probably be more bumps along the way, right? But as you keep going, that's when the resilience starts building. And the speed bumps get smaller and smaller and smaller. And you just got to keep going.
So it sounds like part of that resilience piece is also developing a faith in yourself that you've so far 100% of the time you've survived what you've gone through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you have to have that faith in yourself. But that goes back to making sure that you're taking care of you, and it's not that selfish thing, right? Mm-hmm. It's just making sure that you're okay.
How do you take care of you, and how do you encourage your clients to take care of themselves to foster that resiliency within them?
I think taking care of me is reminding myself, if I can't be the best of myself, how can I take care of others? Mm-hmm. Right? Especially my kids, my grandkids. How can I be the better part of me when I am not, I'm teaching, but I'm not doing. Mm-hmm. And exactly with my clients, I can teach them all the skills, but if I'm not taking care of me, how is that fair to them? Mm-hmm. So, I think telling the clients and doing what I say is very important, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it sounds like it's what I'm hearing you say is it's the difference between teaching someone with words, but totally doing something different.
Exactly.
Or teaching them with words, but also modeling that in how you live, so that it's a fully integrated view of like, this is what it looks like.
You absolutely have to model that, because how is that fair to yourself?
I love that you bring up this idea of fair to yourself, because I'm curious, was what's fair to yourself, do you think that was part of generationally what was given, or a thought process, or do you feel like that's a place where you've been a change agent thinking about what's fair to you?
It's definitely a generational thing, right? Because growing up, we were always taught, do for others. Mm-hmm. Do for others. And if you're doing for yourself, it's kind of a selfish thing. Mm-hmm. But then it goes back to, how can I care for others when I can't even care for myself? Mm-hmm. So it's very important to me to teach my clients that it's okay to be selfish when it's not really being selfish. Mm-hmm.
So I kind of almost hear this as like an ownership piece, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and I hear you as a change agent in that, because almost what was unspoken before was, I'm going to pour out everything I have taking care of you. And my expectation is that if you love me, you will pour everything out taking care of me. And we will live in this, therapeutic codependent type of place, because we don't take care of ourselves.
Right.
And what I'm hearing you say is the change agent piece is, I have to take care of myself. And then from being in a solid place, I can give support.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's extremely important to even let other therapists know that it's okay to seek therapy. It's okay to get help, because we all struggle. Nobody's perfect.
Exactly. I think that would be the most amazing, first question ever when you meet a therapist. Mm-hmm. Tell me how many years of therapy you've done on yourself, and what were the outcomes?
Absolutely.
I would just love that. I know they encourage it in school, but the best therapists are the ones who are constantly fine-tuning.
And I think, a lot of therapists come into this field because they do have past, right? And I don't know if a lot of people understand that. We are in this field because we do have our own past, and we do have our own traumas, and we want to help others and relate. And we know because we relate to them better.
Yeah, I love that, because as a therapist, a lot of times who we are and what we've gone through is our tool, right? That becomes kind of that barometer. And I think about computers, right? I love, computers. I love the way technology has changed. And I remember, back in the 90s with the DOS dial-up, right?
Absolutely.
I don't want to go see a technician today whose only frame of reference was computers back in the 90s. Because it's not the same, right? That's not the same even a little bit. And I think when we're talking about resilience, part of that resilience is realizing, just as much as computers have changed from, the dial-up, AOL, you've got mail moments, to something where they're literally handheld and every part of it, AI, all of the things, right? That we want to be around people who are changing and growing in time as well. And that's a big part of resilience.
Absolutely. And I think it's hard, because when one person's healing and the other one's not, it kind of loses that balance. And that's why it's very important that we change the whole family as a whole. And I've seen that within my own family.
Yeah, it creates that tension, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes we think that tension is bad, but oftentimes that tension is moving us forward past that speed bump onto something different.
Yes.
I love that. As we kind of think about some practical tips for families, like as somebody's listening to us or thinking about it, give them a couple practical tips of do this. I know we said get therapy, huge. What else?
I think learning coping skills and knowing your boundaries, right? I think for me, it's boundaries and limits. If you are at your limit, we never want to get there, right? So here's the thermometer. This is the 10. I want you to be at a 3 or a 4. Once you get there, I want you to learn some skills to kind of reduce that so you're not going past that, right? Whether that's self-care, going for a walk, doing something you love, finding a hobby. Those are extremely important to keep you grounded.
So I love that you're talking about how to help somebody not get past that boiling point and then having kind of the regret of however that ended, right? Like really feeling like they're in control of those emotions and what's happening within them.
Yeah.
I also love that there's a part in this where, again, without saying it, you're saying, make sure that you're checking in with yourself to know what's going on with you.
Check in yourself, check in with others, right? Especially for the men out there who are struggling. It's okay to say I'm struggling. It's okay to talk about that because I see that so much where they're just like, I'm good. But are you really?
And it's okay to not be okay.
Absolutely.
And not okay doesn't mean broken.
Yes. Yes. I mean, we all have a little breaks in us, but that doesn't mean nothing.
It's part of being human.
And resilient.
And resilient. And those are the places that where we're like, okay, we've gone through some things.
Yes.
And we've learned how to get through things. And we've learned how to share things. Talk to me about like, what would you tell a client about how they would share that they're struggling? Like if somebody's like, that sounds really great, but that's not for me. Like how would they take a baby step towards that?
Well, some of my clients don't like using certain words, right? Like, I feel sad. Okay, let's find another word for sad. What does that look like to you? And they'll pick some random word, even banana. And they'll literally use that code word and start it that way. Even if you have to change words on what they mean to you, let's make it a silly word just to start talking.
So to start kind of acknowledging where we're at, right?
Yes.
And I think about a gas tank, right? If we were like, ooh, I don't ever want to talk about gas. Like, what's going to happen to our car?
Yeah, it's going to explode or die or...
Yeah, all the things. I mean, I'm not like a car person, but I know
Right.
like in general,
I'm all
like
the cars
it's
explode.
not good. Yeah, it's not good. I saw one on fire, so I think so. Right? But it's that idea of like, where's your gas tank at?
Right.
And what do you need to fill it up? Or what do you need to kind of maintain it? Do you have enough to go the distance? You know, you're a quarter of a tank. Maybe I'm not going to be driving to Santa Fe today.
Yes.
Right? And so you're using code words to help people check in with themselves and then to be able to just kind of identify where their tank's at or what's going on with their check engine light or whatever's come on in the car so that they can not ignore an override.
Right. Right. And finding things that fulfill you. What's going to fill up that tank? What makes you happy?
So Anna, what do you do to fill up your tank?
Oh, this is a little bit hard for me because my grandbabies just moved and they really help fill my tank. But now they moved to another state, so they're 12 hours away. And now I'm just trying to find other things that help me, right? I've been seeing my friends a lot more. I've been exercising a lot more, just doing things that not only keep my mind busy, but also keep me happy.
Which is literally the definition of resilience. What you're talking about is really going back to the drawing board and being resilient, even though this sucks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Like, ugh, so dumb.
Devastated.
Yeah. And yet, how am I going to get through that?
Right. And I think for me too, it's also looking forward to what's next.
I love that. I think about like resilient roots, right? And to me, it's interesting to have a plant sitting right here, because for me, a resilient root, when you're talking about that, is that there's constant growth.
Right.
Right? There's something that we're pursuing. We're receiving water, we're receiving nutrients, we're receiving those things that help us to continue to grow and, kind of in the speed bump analogy, keep moving forward versus stay stuck and stagnant.
Absolutely. And change is hard. It's not easy. And everybody's going to go through change in their life, and it's scary, but sometimes you got to do things scared.
I love that. Do things scared. And I think change is hard and staying stuck is hard. So we have to choose our hard. And I choose resiliency.
I do too.
And I think that's one of the things, Anna, like you epitomize that personally, professionally, that you make those hard choices, even in the middle of, 12 hours away grandbabies, right? Like you're figuring out ways to stay connected with them. You're figuring out ways to keep yourself resilient and choosing hard, but choosing hard moving forward versus choosing hard staying stuck.
Yeah.
And breaking those generational patterns of we just don't talk about it.
Absolutely. We have to talk about it.
Gosh, Anna, you bring so much wisdom. Thank you so much for just not only embodying what it means to be resilient, but also teaching people from your lived experience how to walk the path that is hard. It's not an easy path, and you just bring so much hope and healing to your family, to the community, to me. Like you truly like embody resilience, and I could not be more grateful for, our root connection in that resilience.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm honored to try to change people's lives, because that's my ultimate goal. If I can just change one person, I'd be happy.
It'll be worth it.
Definitely.
The pain would all be worth it.
Definitely.
So thank you so much today for listening to Resilient Roots with TFC Talks. Make sure to follow us on all of the social media platforms. Make sure to include the hashtag Resilient Roots as you move forward, not staying stuck, changing the patterns that have been built before you to really identify what works for you so that you can live your happy, whole, and healthy self.